The pieces are moving into place, and if you understand the pattern, you'll see what's coming before it hits the headlines. Right now, an American carrier strike group is sailing into waters where every movement carries weight, where the difference between deterrence and disaster is measured in nautical miles and split-second decisions. This isn't just another military deployment. This is the United States positioning its most powerful conventional weapon within striking range of Iran, and the implications reach far beyond the Persian Gulf. We've seen this playbook before: the gradual escalation, the media drumbeat, the careful choreography of crisis. But here's what they're not telling you. Iran isn't the regional pariah it was a decade ago. It's now embedded in security agreements with Russia and China, it's trading outside the dollar system, and it's become a linchpin in the emerging multipolar order. So when Washington moves a carrier group into position, it's not just challenging Tehran, it's testing the entire architecture of resistance to American hegemony. The financial markets know this, the oil markets are already responding, and the real question isn't whether tensions will spike, it's whether this is the spark that ignites something far larger than anyone's prepared to admit. And let's talk about what's really happening here, because the surface narrative and the deeper reality are two very different things. When you see a headline about an aircraft carrier moving into position near Iran, your mind probably goes to images of military might, shows of force, perhaps even the prelude to conflict. And yes, those elements are certainly present. But if you stop there, you're missing the economic chess game, the energy dynamics, and the fundamental restructuring of global power that's driving this entire confrontation. First, let's establish what we're actually looking at. An American carrier strike group isn't just one ship, it's a floating city of military power, approximately 5,000 personnel, dozens of aircraft, guided missile cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and all the support vessels that keep this armada functioning. When this kind of force moves into position, it represents billions of dollars in military hardware and the projection of American power in its most tangible form. The Pentagon will tell you it's about freedom of navigation, about maintaining stability in international waters, about protecting allies and deterring aggression. And on one level that's true, but it's also incomplete. What we're witnessing is the collision of two incompatible visions of how the world should work. On one side, you have the United States and its insistence on maintaining the post-World War II order, an order where Washington sets the rules, enforces them with military power when necessary, and ensures that global trade, particularly in energy, flows through systems it controls. On the other side, you have Iran, which has spent the past 2 decades building an entirely different model. Tehran has constructed what amounts to a resistance economy, one designed specifically to withstand sanctions, to trade outside Western financial systems, and to create regional alliances that don't depend on American approval. Now here's where it gets interesting. Iran today is not the Iran of 2003 or even 2015. Something fundamental has shifted. During the past several years, while Western media was focused on domestic Iranian protests, nuclear negotiations, and the usual narratives about regime change, Iran was quietly integrating itself into the emerging multipolar architecture. It joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It deepened its strategic partnership with Russia to levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. It became a crucial link in China's Belt and Road Initiative, and perhaps most significantly, it started conducting an increasing share of its trade in currencies other than the US dollar. Think about what that means. For decades, American sanctions worked because they could cut countries off from the dollar-denominated global financial system. If you couldn't access dollars, you couldn't buy oil, you couldn't engage in international trade, you essentially became a pariah. This was the weapon that brought countries to their knees without firing a shot. But when Iran began trading oil with China in yuan, when it started using cryptocurrency and barter arrangements, when it developed workarounds through Russian and Chinese banking systems, the effectiveness of that weapon diminished. Not completely, sanctions still hurt the Iranian economy considerably, but the existential threat they once posed has been blunted. This is what truly terrifies policymakers in Washington, though they rarely say it out loud. It's not really about nuclear weapons, despite what the official rhetoric suggests. Israel has nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons. The real concern is that Iran represents a successful model of resistance to the unipolar order. If Iran can survive and even thrive while operating outside the dollar system, while defying American sanctions, while building alternative alliances, then what's to stop other countries from following the same path? What happens to American leverage when the tools that have enforced compliance for 70 years stop working? So when that carrier group moves into position, it's not just about deterring an Iranian nuclear program or protecting shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, though those are certainly factors. It's about sending a message to everyone watching. It's about reminding the world that, regardless of economic shifts or alternative financial systems, the United States still has the military power to enforce its will. It's a demonstration that when other forms of leverage erode, there's always the implicit threat of force. But here's the complication that makes this situation so dangerous. Iran has spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this scenario. After watching what happened to Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, both of whom gave up their weapons programs and were subsequently overthrown, Tehran drew a very simple conclusion: never be defenseless and never trust American security guarantees. So Iran invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities. It developed sophisticated missile and drone technology. It built a network of proxy forces and allied militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It fortified its position in ways that make a conventional military strike enormously costly. Let me paint you a picture of what a conflict would actually look like, because this isn't Desert Storm and Iran isn't Iraq in 1991. If the United States launched airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or military installations, Iran wouldn't try to match American forces plane for plane or ship for ship. That would be suicidal. Instead, Iran would activate its asymmetric playbook. Hezbollah in Lebanon could launch thousands of rockets at Israel. Shia militias in Iraq could target American bases and personnel. Houthi forces in Yemen could intensify attacks on Saudi Arabia and disrupt shipping through the Red Sea. Iranian missiles and drones could strike American military installations across the Gulf region, and most critically, Iran could attempt to close or severely disrupt traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. That last point deserves special emphasis. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. It's only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iran has anti-ship missiles, mines, small attack boats, and submarines specifically designed to operate in these confined waters. Could the US Navy eventually reopen the strait? Almost certainly. But eventually could mean weeks or months, and in that time, global oil prices would spike to levels that would make the 1970s oil shocks look tame by comparison. We're talking about potential economic disruption that would make the 2008 financial crisis look manageable. And here's what keeps serious analysts up at night. Russia and China wouldn't just stand by and watch. They might not intervene militarily, that would risk direct great power conflict, but they would certainly provide Iran with intelligence, potentially advanced weapon systems, economic support, and diplomatic cover. Russia needs Iran as a partner in Syria and as a counterweight to American influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia. China needs Iranian oil and needs the Belt and Road corridors through Iranian territory to function. Both Moscow and Beijing see Iran as a crucial partner in their vision of a multipolar world order. So what you'd have is not just a US-Iran conflict, but a proxy confrontation that tests the entire structure of global alliances. Every country would be forced to choose sides, not necessarily militarily, but economically and diplomatically. The pressure on European allies to support American actions would be immense, but their economic interests increasingly pull them toward maintaining trade with China and Russia. Middle Eastern states would face similar calculations. Traditional American allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been diversifying their relationships and would be deeply reluctant to get drawn into a conflict that could devastate their own economies and infrastructure. Now let's talk about the domestic American dimension, because this matters enormously. The United States is deeply divided politically, and public appetite for new Middle Eastern wars is essentially non-existent. The Iraq War and the Afghanistan debacle killed any enthusiasm for large-scale military interventions. Poll after poll shows Americans want their government focused on problems at home, not new conflicts abroad. But the national security establishment, the defense contractors, and the foreign policy blob in Washington often operate with their own logic, one that's disconnected from public sentiment. They see American credibility being tested. They see adversaries probing for weakness. They see the window for maintaining primacy potentially closing. This creates a dangerous dynamic. You have a political class that knows major military action would be domestically unpopular, but you also have a strategic community that believes showing weakness or backing down would invite further challenges. So what do you get? Incremental escalation, movements of military assets that are meant to deter but that can also create their own momentum, shows of force that are intended as signals but that can be misinterpreted. This is how accidents happen, how situations spiral beyond anyone's initial intentions. And let's be brutally honest about something else. The intelligence picture is never as clear as officials claim after the fact. Remember the absolute certainty about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Remember the unshakable conviction about how quickly the Taliban would be defeated? Intelligence agencies are staffed by humans with biases, institutional pressures, and political considerations. When there's pressure to justify a particular policy, intelligence has a way of conforming to support that policy. This doesn't mean intelligence professionals are dishonest. Most are dedicated public servants, but the system itself creates incentives that can skew analysis. So when you hear confident assertions about Iranian nuclear timelines or Iranian intentions, maintain a healthy skepticism. The truth is that intelligence on Iran's nuclear program is genuinely difficult to acquire. Iran learned from Israel's destruction of Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 and has dispersed and hardened its facilities. Some are built deep underground, some are dual-use facilities where it's hard to determine what's actually happening. The picture is murky, which means there's room for worst-case assumptions to drive policy. What's the end game here? That's the question that doesn't have a good answer. If the goal is regime change in Iran, history suggests that's extraordinarily difficult to achieve through external pressure alone. Sanctions haven't done it. International isolation hasn't done it. The Iranian government has proven remarkably resilient, partly through repression, partly through nationalism, and partly through the regime's ability to blame external enemies for internal problems. If the goal is to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, a military strike might set the program back but wouldn't eliminate it, and would likely convince Tehran that having nuclear weapons is the only guarantee of survival. If the goal is to force Iran back into compliance with Western demands, the current trajectory of escalation seems more likely to push Iran further into the arms of Russia and China than to bring it to the negotiating table. Here's what I think is actually happening, and this is where you have to look beyond the immediate crisis to the bigger picture. We're living through the death throes of the unipolar moment, that period from 1991 to roughly 2008 when the United States was the undisputed global hegemon, when American military and economic power was so overwhelming that most countries had no choice but to accommodate themselves to American preferences. That era is over. It didn't end with a bang, but with a series of policy failures, economic crises, and the rise of peer competitors who refuse to accept permanent subordinate status. The problem is that American foreign policy institutions haven't fully adjusted to this new reality. They're still operating with a unipolar mindset in an increasingly multipolar world. They still believe that sufficient pressure will bring adversaries into line. They still assume that American military superiority translates automatically into strategic success. They still think in terms of maintaining primacy rather than managing a more complex, competitive environment. And this gap between perception and reality is where the danger lies. Iran is a test case. It's not the most powerful country challenging the American-led order. That would be China. It's not the most militarily formidable. That would be Russia. But Iran is significant because it's been openly defying American dictates for 45 years and has not only survived, but has increased its regional influence. If Washington can't deal effectively with Iran, what does that say about its ability to manage challenges from Beijing or Moscow? This is the credibility question that drives so much of the policy. But credibility is a strange thing. Sometimes the pursuit of credibility leads you to double down on failing strategies because admitting error seems weak. Sometimes maintaining credibility requires doing the very thing that's counterproductive to your actual interests. And sometimes what looks like strength in the short term undermines your position in the long term. A military confrontation with Iran might demonstrate American willingness to use force, but if it leads to a protracted conflict, economic disruption, and further alienation of allies, has credibility actually been enhanced or damaged? The financial markets are watching all of this very carefully. Oil traders are pricing in risk premiums. Defense stocks are moving. Currency markets are reacting to safe haven flows. Smart money understands that a conflict with Iran isn't just a regional event, it's a systemic risk to the global economy at a time when that economy is already fragile. We're dealing with high inflation, supply chain vulnerabilities, debt levels that are unprecedented in peacetime, and a financial system that's more interconnected and therefore more susceptible to cascading failures than ever before. Throw a major Middle East conflict into that mix and you're playing with fire. What should people understand about this moment? First, that the official narratives are always incomplete. There are deeper currents, economic interests, institutional momentum, and ideological commitments that drive policy in ways that don't make it into the press releases. Second, that we're living through a genuine historical transition, one where the rules that governed international relations for decades are being rewritten. This creates uncertainty, danger, but also opportunity for those who can see clearly. Third, that military power, while still enormously important, is no longer as decisive as it once was. The ability to destroy is not the same as the ability to build, control, or shape outcomes in your favor. The carrier strike group moving into position near Iran is a symptom of these larger dynamics. It's a manifestation of American frustration with a changing world, Iranian determination to chart its own course, and the dangerous intersection of declining hegemony with rising resistance. How this plays out over the coming weeks and months will tell us a lot about whether cooler heads can prevail or whether we're headed toward a confrontation that nobody really wants, but that institutional momentum and strategic miscalculation could make almost inevitable. Watch carefully, question everything, and understand that what's presented as simple is almost always more complex than it appears.